Hi everyone, my name is Glenda with SureFit Designs, sometimes referred to as Glenda the Good Stitch. In this Make It Sew beginner series, something that all of you should know how to do is to sew on a collar. So today I'm going to show you an easy process to get a collar attached. It's a collar like that I'm wearing on this blouse. It's called a rolled collar. It attaches, it rolls up, and then it rolls over. The same collar is found on the collar of this blouse on the mannequin. As we take a look at the collar pattern pieces, you're going to see basically your under collar and upper collar. Now you'll notice on the upper collar, or excuse me, on the under collar that I have interfaced it. And under normal circumstances, I wouldn't interface with a dark interfacing like this. It would be white, but for demonstration purposes, I've used a dark interfacing so you could see it, and I've used a different color of collar for the upper collar. You'll also notice with the interfacing that there are no seam allowances on the interfacing, and that's the way you want to cut it. You don't want to have bulk of interfacing getting into those seam allowances because you're trying to reduce bulk once it's all stitched and turned. For the upper collar, I've also made some marking or sewing indicators here. So that's a 5/8 inch stitching line, there's the point, and there's the other 5/8 inch stitching line. And you'll see that at the other side as well. Okay, so as we begin on preparing the collar, you will notice that there are notches here, 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 and here. Now those notches are going to join to the shoulder seam lines of your blouse or your shirt. So let's first of all take the upper collar, and we're going to do what is called stay stitching, where you sew just about a 5/8 inch line. I'm going to sew just a hair inside the 5/8 inch marking, and I'm going to sew from notch to notch, and that's because I'm going to need to clip up to the stay stitching in that notch area. So let's take this to the sewing machine, and I'm going to start, as I said, just a hair inside the 5/8 inch marking. For stay stitching, your stitch length is on normal or 2.5 millimeters, and you don't back stitch. And there I am at the other notch, and we'll just clip the threads. And let me get rid of those long threads because we're not going to need them in the way. Okay. Now, what we need to do is clip through those notches like this up to the stay stitching there and on this side. And then what I need to do is simply press this seam allowance. We're going to fold it in toward the inside of the collar. So that stay stitching simply is going to guide me where to turn that inside, like this. Okay, now what we need to do is take the upper collar and sew it to the under collar. So I'm going to take the right side of the upper collar, and of course this is now the right side of the under collar. I'm just saying that backwards. This is the upper collar and that's the under collar. We're going to take these right sides together like this, and then I'm going to pin the edges in preparation for sewing. My machine is on regular stitch length, and this is a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And I will backstitch here at the beginning. And I will have my needle in the down position. Now as we come up to this collar point, I am going to tighten my stitches just a little bit. Normal is 2.5 millimeters. I'm going to go down to 1.5 millimeters just to reinforce this point. And this is a lesson actually on doing square corners and points that I taught you a little bit earlier in the Make It Sew series. And I want to come up to the point, my needle's in the down position, I'm going to raise the presser foot, I'm going to pivot the fabric around the needle, and I'm going to do one diagonal stitch. That one diagonal stitch is going to allow the corner to turn and look more pointed. And so now I'm going to come down. You know what? I'm going to do one more stitch there diagonally because I'm not quite on the 5/8. That looks better like that. And so depending on how tight your stitches are, 1 or 2 stitches actually works. And I'm going to stitch for about 1/2 inch with that really tight. Then I'm going to go back to 2.5 stitches per inch. Now we're coming up to the other point. I'm going to tighten the stitches once again to 1.5 millimeters. I'm going to come up to that little diagonal, and here we come down the other side. Then what we're going to do is trim and grade the seam allowances. So once again, in a previous lesson, I talked about trimming, which is cutting the seam allowance by half, and then grading is to cut it by half again. And we'll do that along the upper edge. And I should have trimmed those both at the same time. Let me go in there and do that. I'm only doing a portion of this, and then I'm going to go back and finish up the whole thing. And then I am grading and cutting down by half again. And then what we'll do at that collar point is a diagonal cut like this and like this and across the other side. So we get a really nice sharp point. Okay, now I'm just going to finish up trimming and grading the entire collar. And then the next thing to do is take this collar and turn it right sides out. And I've shown you this point turner before. You'll want to have one handy. And then take that and just simply poke the corner of the collar out. And be careful that you don't push too hard, because you don't want this point turner coming through the fibers there. And I might just finish that off with a pin. You've got to be really careful when you use a pin to pull the point out, though, because you don't want to pull the fibers. And now you see a perfect point. So the next thing we're going to do is press this edge, and we're going to turn this so that we get a nice rolled edge on the top. So now we're going to go ahead and press the collar. When it's open like this, what you'll want to do is press as much of this seam as possible. What you're doing here is helping to meld the thread into the fabric. You can't get the iron in a long way without putting a lot of creases in your collar. So I've just pressed as much as I could. Then I'm going to take this and I'm just going to, I'll remove the ham now and just press on the flat surface. And you can see that this peach colored fabric is my upper collar. And I want to make sure that the upper collar is most dominant. In other words, I don't want any of that blue showing. That's the under collar. So I just have to roll it a little bit more. And you just need to use your fingers to do this and roll that upper collar over top of the under collar to get it nice and crisp and sharp on the edge. And we've got beautiful points on this collar. So the next step in attaching the collar is to have the garment prepared. This is the front of the garment up here, and this is the back of the garment down here. And I've only done just a shorty little sample because we're just dealing actually with this neck circumference at this point in time. And I've done a gray fabric here, and of course there are the shoulder seams right there, all seam finished. There is one other thing that I've done in preparation to add the collar, is I've done what is called stay stitching. The stay stitching that I've done on the neckline is in this entire curved area. And I did describe stay stitching, but I also wanted to draw your attention to this brochure that we have for you, and it's all on sewing terminology. What do these terms all mean? And so in SureFitDesigns.com, if you go to free stuff, you're going to see this sewing glossary and terminology, and it has all the common terms that are used in sewing. You'll want to go and download yourself a complimentary copy of this. And in review, stay stitching is done just about 5/8 of an inch away from the raw edge. And we did the stay stitching because now I need to do what's called clipping to the stay stitching to open up that curve so that when I start putting this collar, the straight collar, onto the curved edge, this curve will open up to fit the collar. And that stay stitching is usually done about every 1/2 inch. So you can see what happens when I take that curved edge and I open like this, it opens those clips up, and that's exactly what we need. So now you're going to take your prepared collar and you take the under collar, which in this case is the blue piece, and you're going to take this shoulder notch and match it to that shoulder seam, and we'll start pinning. And I usually go right to the other shoulder seam first and get that pinned in place. And then I do like to pin from the shirt side of the collar application. And here you can see, but I'm opening out that curvature so that the seam allowance of the neckline will now match with that straight edge of the collar. And the other thing that you should be aware of, in this particular collar application, there is no back neck facing. This is a really neat technique where the collar is going to come over top of the seam allowances. So initially, from notch to notch, which is shoulder seam to shoulder seam, I have pinned only the under collar together with the body. Now what I'm going to do is take both the upper collar and under collar together, and I'm going to start pinning that to the neck edge, because we are going to sew all 3 layers together in the front neck edge. It's only the back neck edge where we sew just the 1 layer of collar. And the same thing on the other side. Both layers of your collar get pinned to the neck edge of the shirt or blouse, in the front only. Now we're ready to take this to the sewing machine and attach the 2 pieces together. So I'm going to start at the front edge of the collar. We're going to go to the sewing machine, and at this point in time you can baste the collar on to make sure that everything is all okay. I'm just going to go ahead and regular stitch it, but I do want to make sure I stop and check periodically that there are no little puckers under there. I am going to stitch with my needle in the down position, and I will back stitch to begin. Now, when I get to the shoulder line, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to make sure that this upper collar is well pulled out of the way. I definitely don't want that caught in the back neck stitching. And then the next thing you need to do is just check it to make sure that everything is good. And you can see that there are no puckers on the shirt side and there are no puckers on the collar side. So that looks really good. The next thing that we're going to do is put on the facings now. I have the facings prepared, and they are right here. And once again, I've used a very dark interfacing so that you can see them. I have stay stitched the neck edge of the facing, and I've clipped to the stitching. So we'll just lay the facing onto the front, and you can see that I'm opening up that neck edge of the facing as I lay it over top of that collar piece. So this facing is actually going to sandwich that collar inside and finish off all the raw edges on the front of the shirt. We'll take this to the sewing machine. And when you come to the lapel point of the front of the garment here, once again, I've talked with you about points. I'm going to reduce the stitch length down to 1.5 millimeters. I'm going to get very close to that point, and I'm going to do a diagonal stitch to help that look nice and crisp. And I'll stitch for about 1/2 inch with that tighter stitch length, and then turn it back to normal. So all of this is going to get trimmed and graded, and a corner is going to be clipped. This is now going to turn to the inside like this. The corner will get pushed out, and there's your collar laying nice and flat. And we'll finish up the back neck edge as well as we progress. So before I actually trim and grade those corners, what I would like you to do is make sure that obviously you do the other side as well. So that's your next step, is preparing this side. At this point, I'd like to show you what it looks like when both the facings are in place. I sewed one on for you, and I went ahead and sewed the other facing in place. And of course, that sandwiched the collar inside on the front neck edge. I also have trimmed the seam allowance, which means cutting it in half, and I've graded it, which means cutting the facing seam allowance down by 1/2 again. And then I angled the corner where the lapel is going to turn to the inside. Now, the next thing we do before we actually can turn all of this and press it is we need to get in to this back neck edge, and we need to clip up to where the stitching stopped at this collar piece right here. So that's where the stitching stopped. Something else you'll notice is that on the facings, I stopped at the seam line, not all the way across the seam allowance when I was attaching the facing onto the neck edge. So I'm just going to turn that back out of the way, and now what I'm going to do is clip right up to this stitching, right like this. So I want to get all of that turned inside, and you really do have to clip pretty close to that stitching. So that gets turned out of the way, and I'm just going to clip right up to that stitching, like that. Now what you're going to do is take your facings and turn them to the inside, and use your point turner again, and very carefully push out the point of the lapel of that facing. And of course, this is all going to need to be pressed. And then as we keep turning to the inside, you can see how the collar is now sitting on that front neck edge. Let's get this other one turned. We'll take a look at it this way now. So this remaining seam allowance right here is now going to get turned up inside like this, and it gets completely enclosed in that upper collar. So the next thing we need to do is give this a good press. All right, as we continue on with pressing, now what I'm going to do is just open this up as much as I can And I'm going to press the seam allowances towards the facing. And again, go up as high as you can. And then take your facing and press it towards the inside, just gently rolling that seam so that it's more towards the inside of your garment rather than the outside. And make sure you get that collar point, or the lapel point I should say, like this. And of course we need to do the same thing on the other side. I'll give it a quick press on the inside, pressing the seam allowances towards the facing, and then rolling just ever so slightly with that facing towards the inside and up to the lapel point, like that. And of course this is all going to turn back like this. It's really very pretty. Now I'm just going to take the hem and I'll show you the back neck curvature and how to press that. So you'll remember we clipped up to the shoulder line and that stitching. So now you take this remaining seam allowance right here and you're going to press it inside, and you just want to use the tip of your iron to get that pressed up inside and prevent any wrinkles from happening in the body of the garment. Now this will come over top like this, and this completely gets enclosed within that seam allowance and the shoulder seam. So the next step is to stitch it. Now once that's been pressed, you can see that what I've done there is I've pushed the seam allowances up inside the collar like this. I just wanted to show that to you before I started pinning it. It's absolutely a beautiful, clean, neat option and way to finish the back neck edge without having a facing back there. And so now all I am doing is pinning to hold that in place so that I can start stitching it. And notice that seam allowance went right up inside beautifully, and the facing comes back and meets the edge of the seam allowance just like it should. And now at this point, if you feel more comfortable, you can hand stitch your neck edge down at the back, or what I'm going to do is take it to the sewing machine and just start stitching. And that should be fine too, as long as everything's all on a perfect 1-to-1, it will all turn out and look good. So this line of machine stitching is done very close to the folded edge of the seam that's turned up inside. And I likely will back stitch here, just 2 or 3 stitches to lock it. And I shouldn't need the needle in the down position here. And I just want to stitch very carefully because I'm stitching approximately a 1/16 of an inch away from that folded edge of the collar. That looks pretty darn good. And here's what it looks like on the inside, right there. And of course these threads I would just clip. And we'll take a look at the other side in a moment. And so that looks really good. And then at this point, these seam allowances, all you need to do is hand stitch the seam allowance of the shoulder line together with the facing. And so that's why they're pinned just in place there. But that's, you can see it's a really neat back neck finish. And here's what the other side looks like. And of course your collar is going to come up and roll over and sit like that. And you all know that I've been using a contrasting color of thread to show you all of the different steps so that you can see it. You of course will be working in the same color of thread as your fabric, and it will all blend beautifully. So that's an easy rolled collar, and there has a little lapel to go on it like this. And I think you're going to find that quite an easy technique as a beginner seamstress. One last thing that I want to point out, if I didn't do this at the beginning, is that you will notice that the only thing that I had sewn in this garment was the shoulder seams. And that's because it was still basically one big long flat unit. Had I sewn the side seams as well, it would now become a three-dimensional form. And so it's just easier in the flatter format in order to put a collar on. One of the things that I've been trying to teach you as we've gone along in these lessons is the actual progression and the step of what you do first and then second, what you do sequentially when you're sewing a garment together, because all of it is all going to meld together as you start putting your garments together. If you've enjoyed this video, and I certainly hope that you have, I invite you to join the SureFit Designs community, and you can do that in 3 easy steps. Number 1, just go on over to surefitdesigns.com and subscribe to the newsletter, and when you do, you're going to receive free Getting Started gifts. Number 2, you're likely in YouTube watching this right now. Please make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel and like this video. And there's buttons below the video to do both of those things. And also, we now have a Facebook user group, and all you need to do is go to facebook.com/SureFitDesigns. On the left-hand side, where all the links are shown, it says Groups and SureFit Designs. Go ahead and ask to join, and we will approve you right away. We have people from all over the world interacting with one another, sharing the garments they've made with SureFit Designs and asking questions. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.